Hey, so how did the party of Lincoln become the party of Trump? How did the party that ended slavery, reluctantly, become the party that wants to bring it back, eagerly? And how the hell did the party of Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederacy, become the party of Barack Obama, our first black president? How the hell did the party that advocated slavery, went to war to defend slavery, started a terrorist insurgency to bring slavery back, and maintained slavery until World War II, become the party that kind of thinks slavery is a bad idea? To understand how we got the politics of today, you have to understand politics before the Civil War. Today, we talk about political parties in terms of ideologies. We call the Conservative Party of the Democrats liberal, and the Fascist Party of the Republicans conservative. In the mid-19th century, that wasn't really the case. The political parties were a lot more honest back then. They were all about power, and achieving power meant securing voting blocks. People were more grouped by how they would vote based on their interests, and parties constructed platforms to appeal to those interests. Now, obviously, no single platform could be constructed to appeal to all blocks, so the two parties, always two parties in our electoral system, snagged the two largest groups they could. Then they appealed to the groups left out with various appeals and concessions. The end result of this was that the Republican Party, by the time of the Civil War, was the party of urban interests, and the Democrats were the party of rural interests. This meant that the Republicans were the party of the North and the Democrats the party of the South. If you look at a map of the antebellum South, it should be obvious why the Republicans couldn't make inroads there. There were two cities in the South, Charleston and New Orleans. Everything else was dedicated to farming. Those two cities were absolutely, unequivocally tied to the farming interests of their surroundings. But why didn't the Democrats have a strong presence in the North? Why didn't they have support among rural Northerners? Because those rural Northerners were economically tied to the many, many cities of the North. Southern farming meant cash crops powered by slave labor, principally cotton and tobacco. Northern farming meant food to feed those hungry northern cities. Because rural and urban aren't good descriptors. The South was a slave economy dedicated to producing raw materials. The North was an industrial and shipping economy powered by machinery. Their economic interests were radically different. Now, that's not to say that there weren't divisions. The North still had tension between the working class and the elite owners. They still had to deal with economic parasites like the robber barons. And the South had people owned as slaves. They couldn't vote, but they still had a strong interest in not being slaves. Funny how no political party sprang up to answer that call. To make a long story short, the Civil War happened as a result of slavery. The Republican Party and its voters were divided between those who didn't like slavery but didn't want to do anything about it, and those who hated it with a passion and demanded that it be ended. The Democratic Party was vehemently in favor of slavery and wanted to defend it. At least, that's how it was at the start of the war. By the end of the war, many thousands of Union soldiers had spent a few years fighting alongside people who explained in great detail how awful slavery was. And those soldiers came to hate slavery with a passion as a result. After the war, the Union kind of gave up on the whole doing the right thing. Now, don't get me wrong, it took a while. But the South was very determined to keep being the bad guys and started a terrorist insurgency, the KKK, in order to fight for their right to be the absolute worst human beings alive. The U.S. managed not to learn their lesson there. See Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, etc. In any event, after 10 years of terrorism, the North threw up its hands in disgust and said, fine, we don't really like black people anyway. Do what you want. And the South rapidly enacted Jim Crow, plunging blacks into a nightmare hellscape that only started to go away in the 1960s, and which is still with us today. So, After the Civil War, the Democrats got a death grip on Southern politics, and the Republicans got the rest of the country. The Democrats became the party of white Southern racism, and the Republicans became the party of politics. The South didn't really have politics so much as a political charade dedicated to hurting black people and making sure the South never changed. So the Republican Party did what every party has done in the U.S. history when it was the only party available. It started to divide. Always two parties, remember? It developed a conservative wing dedicated to big business and a progressive wing dedicated to helping the poor. Early on, that progressive wing gave us Teddy Roosevelt, a damn fine man who tried and failed in 1900 to finally end slavery once and for all. The conservative wing gave us William Taft, one of the most benightedly corrupt presidents ever, now eclipsed by Trump, and Calvin Coolidge, who watched in benign disinterest as the country slid from a decade of rampant violent crime to a decade of poverty and despair, the Roaring '20s and the Great Depression, respectively. The Democrats only gave us 2 men and 3 presidents in the period leading up to World War II. Grover Cleveland, a conservative from New York who served 2 non-consecutive terms, and who technically counts twice, and Woodrow Wilson. Wilson was a vile piece of shit who only won because Teddy Roosevelt tried to form a third party, dividing the Republican vote. Americans really learned a lesson from that one and certainly never tried to repeat it. That's sarcasm. Fuck the Green Party. The next big change was the Depression. A laissez-faire economic policy caused it, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt was determined to end it. Now, FDR was indeed related to Teddy Roosevelt. They were distant cousins. Now, FDR was really the first of the modern Democrats. As a Democrat from New York, like Cleveland, he wasn't really part of the Southern wing of the Democratic Party. It was more about not being part of the corrupt Republican politics of New York City and working for the poor. FDR's presidency was wildly different from Coolidge's. He enacted socialism. He created a raft of government programs and started spending lots of money. He built infrastructure and put in place Social Security and socialized medicine. He pulled the country out of the Depression over the course of 8 years and laid the groundwork for a massively industrialized entry into World War II. There was a brief Republican backlash led by the conservative wing, a few members of which also wanted to stage a coup, which was thwarted by the military man they asked to lead it. Anyway, the backlash saw the country descend back into recession and was swiftly ended. FDR was able to do all this because he had the support of Congress. He built a coalition out of small farmers, big farmers, and urban workers. The urban elites were the ones who didn't support him and tried to fight him. After all, they had money and could wait out a depression. FDR got the people who were starving. This included racist Southern Democrats. Thus, FDR's socialism had to make some big concessions that rendered it not actually socialism. It had to exclude blacks. I want to go ahead and be very clear here. I don't want this to be a hagiography of FDR. His legacy has some huge goddamn stains on it, even apart from excluding huge swaths of the population from his pseudo-socialist reforms. Not least of those is that he responded to pressure from white California farmers and helped them steal land from immigrant Japanese farmers, locking them up in concentration camps for the duration of the war. Anyway, World War II happened, and FDR died early in his unprecedented 4th term in office. He was succeeded by Harry S. Truman, also a Democrat in the modern mold. Truman finished Roosevelt's final term and won his own 2nd term. Then he changed American politics for good by trying to cement a modern democratic legacy. He tried to pass civil rights legislation. In the wake of World War II and the horrors of Nazi Germany, progressives felt that maybe the U.S. was ready not to be assholes to brown people. Southern racists were not ready. Strom Thurmond, senator from South Carolina, successfully filibustered Truman's legislation in 1947. Then he led Southern racists in forming the Dixiecrats, formerly the Southern wing of the Democratic Party. They were now a party in their own right, and would shape U.S. politics for the next 20 years. From 1948 to 1968, the U.S. had three parties: the Republicans, the Democrats, and the Dixiecrats. Like I said before, the Republicans, as part of a largely one-party system, had already undergone a soft division into a conservative wing and a progressive wing. This split in the Democrats was largely the same thing, a split between the old Southern racists and the progressive coalition built by FDR. Now, just as a one-party system is unstable in the U.S. electoral system, so too is a three-party system. One way or another, the system has to collapse back into two parties. The only question is which of those three parties would be destroyed. The result would be decided by the soft split in the Republican Party. In the middle of the 20th century, the two wings of the Republican Party were named after two of its more famous members. Rockefeller Republicans, named for liberal New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller, and Goldwater Republicans, named for conservative Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater. Over time, the Republican Party lost more of its liberal Rockefeller members to the Democrats, and the conservative Goldwater Republicans aligned more closely with the Dixiecrats. To understand this, it helps to see that the U.S. was undergoing significant economic development during that time. Spurred by its dominance as a nuclear superpower, and in the absence of significant opposition from anyone but Russia and China, the U.S. was able to develop a global hegemonic empire. We developed a system of colonies, independent states, and dependent states to feed our newly built war machines, and to serve as both a source of raw materials and markets for our newly built commercial apparatus. But the South didn't see that growth. Still mired in Jim Crow slavery, the South found it difficult to develop. Instead, black workers migrated north and west, feeding the economic booms outside the South. They also shaped culture, as racism caused the newly affluent white middle class to flee the newly black cities for the newly constructed suburbs. In other words, after the war, the North saw a great deal of growth and change and development and cash. The South bought tractors and kept growing cotton and tobacco. The South clung to the good old days. The North got rich. The South became the heartland for racist conservatism, and the North got a fresh appreciation for racism because of all the black people who were finally free to leave the South, because the North suddenly needed manpower that the South suddenly no longer needed. Fast forward to 1968. The Democrats have siphoned off all the liberal Republicans and won a difficult fight to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Republican Party is left with their conservative base and little hope of winning the 1968 election. But they look at the solid South and realize that after guaranteeing blacks the right to vote and integrating schools, there's no way in hell the Dixiecrats and the Democrats are ever getting back together. And the Republicans, thanks to Goldwater's presidential campaign in 1964, where he only won the South, are probably never going to get back the liberal vote. But they do have the opportunity to win votes inside and outside the South. So that bright visionary, Richard Nixon, runs on the Southern strategy. To quote Nixon's political strategist, Kevin Phillips, "From now on, the Republicans are never going to get more than 10 to 20% of the Negro vote, and they don't need to any more than that. But the Republicans would be short-sighted if they weakened enforcement of the Voting Rights Act. The more Negroes who register as Democrats in the South, the sooner the negrophobe whites will quit the Democrats and become Republicans. That's where the votes are. Without that prodding from the blacks, the whites will backslide into their old comfortable arrangement with the local Democrats." Or, to quote Republican strategist Lee Atwater, who committed the cardinal sin of being honest, he thought he was speaking off the record, "You start out in 1954 by saying, by 1968, you can't say that hurts you. Backfires. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. You're getting so abstract now that you're talking about cutting taxes, and all these things you're talking about are totally economic things, and a byproduct of them is that blacks get hurt worse than whites. And subconsciously, maybe that is part of it. I'm not saying that. But I'm saying that if it is getting that abstract and that coded, that we are doing away with the racial problem one way or another. You follow me? Because obviously sitting around and saying we want to cut this is much more abstract than even the busing thing, and a hell of a lot more abstract than... To clarify, the Southern strategy was quite simple. It had only 2 rules. Be racist, just don't sound racist. The first rule is fairly straightforward. If you want to win the South, you have to be a god-awful racist asshole. You have to convince Southern voters that you think black people are animals who deserve to be murdered in the streets. You have to hate every single bit of social progress that has been made since 1620. That's how you win the South. But you need the second rule, or you'll only win the South. The Dixiecrats never won any state outside the Confederacy. The U.S. is pretty goddamn racist right now. In 1968, it was really goddamn racist. But even in 1968, the rest of the country thought the South took it too far. The South was lynching black people all over the place, and bombing churches, and setting dogs on black marchers on national television. The rest of the country was content to just leave black people in grinding poverty and let the police quietly murder them to keep them down. If you want to win the rest of the country, you have to not sound racist. You have to talk about actual policies, and those policies have to be at least one step removed from, I want to hurt black people. And it worked. It worked phenomenally well. Nixon won in 1968 with a comfortable margin, and 1968 was the last time the Dixiecrats fielded a presidential candidate. Nixon won in 1972 with a damn landslide. He had a significant margin in the popular vote, and he won nearly every single vote in the Electoral College. His Democratic opponent, George McGovern, won only the state of Massachusetts and a single county in Maryland. And one weirdo in Virginia decided to give a single Electoral College vote to Libertarian John Huspers. The Southern strategy has been used ever since. Every single Republican candidate, except for one, has had enough sense to talk in code. Instead of screaming about black people marching for their rights, you tip a nod and a wink to your racist audience by talking about law and order. Instead of talking about segregating public schools, you talk about busing and school vouchers and eliminating the Department of Education. Instead of calling black people lazy, you talk about welfare queens. Instead of calling black people criminal, you talk about the need to clean up our inner cities. It took 20 years, but the Republicans took over the South, and the KKK took over the Republicans. Southern politics was very confusing as white racists slowly learned to vote for the erstwhile Party of Lincoln. However, the process was finished by the time Newt Gingrich led the conservative backlash in 1994 in response to the election of Bill Clinton in 1992. There's more to the story, of course. Republicans benefited not only from racism, but from corporate hatred of the socialism and high taxes of the 1950s. The corporate hatred of taxes that pay for socialist programs goes hand in hand with the racist hatred of socialist programs that benefit black people. Those same corporations also helped create the modern evangelical movement by funding none other than Southern darling Billy Graham. And it would be beyond easy to provide evidence for the combination of Republican politics and Southern evangelical Christianity, as well as the ample evidence of religion providing a fertile ground for racism. Instead, I've tried to explain what happened, with some indicators as to why. The full explanation is that every facet of Southern life was built on and around white supremacy. In order for the Republican Party to take advantage of that with the Southern strategy, they had to alter the structure of the party, slightly, and provide a cloak of plausible deniability. The structure of Southern racism remains intact in the politics of the Republican Party today, and the veneer of coded language laid on top of it is what allowed this structure to pervade every corner of U.S. culture today. Oh, I mentioned earlier that the only one politician wasn't smart enough to follow the second rule of the Southern strategy. That was Donald Trump. And he's a topic for another essay.